And I'll just remind you a bit about it, how it functioned. It was built using this, what I call Godley table, in honour of Wynne Godley, showing financial flows between accounts, where those accounts represent aggregate accounts for different classes in society. Starting off with model money in the vault, being paid across. This is like the 19th century free money system where paper money was used for all transactions. So transferring money out of the vault to the firms, which is lending, record the loan, charge interest on the loan. The bank then pays interest by transferring money from its account to the safe of the bank. The bank records the debt being paid. The firm then pays wages to workers. The workers then consume, and the bankers then consume. And when you put it all together with the definitions done in the variables equations reset window, where you define what the constants are, on the COD equation where you define what the actual A, B, C, D and E are, you get this system generated as the Phillips diagram. And when I bring up the player and run it, you get a system which is a sustainable system. You get to the stage where there's positive bank balances and everything except the vault, because everything gets emptied out of the vault. The positive bank balances for workers, capitalists and bankers, positive incomes as well, as I showed last week, and so on. What I want to do today is go on from there a bit. Pardon me, we're on one. Let's bring up the other. Where are we? Okay. Bring up today's lecture and keep on going from that point. So I built that model as I showed you a moment ago. There was one error, by the way. When I defined it live, I have B, which was the payment of interest on loans, being the interest rate on loans times the amount in the deposit account. It should be the loans account, so I've changed that in the model that I'll embed in this particular lecture and put up on the blog as well. That little change there occurred. Now I'm going to add repayment and relending, and then also try converting the parameters to time constant, which is a concept that might be my phone causing that, pardon me. Yes it is, okay. Turn the bugger off. I'll go down well live. Okay, converting parameters to what are called time constants that are a straightforward concept in engineering. It'll be a bit weird getting your head around it, but it does make it much easier to work out what values you should give to these parameters. Then introduce production. So this is a list of the terms that will have turned up and will turn up in the model in more detail. This is a larger model in QED where I'm using these time constants and stating all the various elements inside there in more detail. Again, that's stored on the website. So, and again, this is reminding you once more, that's with the basic flow diagram I've shown you a moment ago, and seeing the graphs of the same thing, where I also showed how incomes can be defined. So, in that sense, I've showed that a pure credit economy can be self-sustaining. If you have a single loan, so the money that generates can circulate throughout the economy indefinitely, causing sustained economic activity, and you get positive bank balances coming out of it and positive incomes as well. So the main thing I'm going to do now is include production inside the whole thing, link, in other words, the monetary flows to the physical flows, and explain where those values came from, expand it to include growth, and then apply the model in a couple of ways. First, to ask a simple question: why do lenders want to create too much debt? Which they clearly do. And then modelling a simple credit crunch. If there was some unexplained slowdown in the rate of circulation of the money in the economy, rather than the type of debt-driven collapse we've had now, then what's the best way to attack it? Do you give money to the banks, or do you give it to the firms and the debtors? So production, first of all. Well, this is something I shouldn't be explaining to a third-year class of economics, but it's a sign of how primitive economic theory has made itself over the whole issue of production, that an overview like this is necessary. So clearly, to produce commodities, you need other commodities. Okay? Commodities are produced by commodities themselves and labour. And what you get is more commodities out than in, and more elaborately transformed as well to some degree. All that works then in factories, which involve a combination of fixed capital, which are machines that transform inputs into outputs. So, for example, a blast furnace will take in iron ore and coal and generate pig iron out. So two of those inputs get completely used up. The blast furnace itself would appreciate, but it's not used up in the production process. So you've got some things which are completely consumed. Marx called that circulating capital. Other things which continue persisting but get depreciated by production. So goods used up entirely in output are part of it, the raw materials, energy and so on. And there's many types of labour involved. You don't just have homogenous labour, you've got skilled labour, unskilled labour, supervisors, people who think they manage, etc., etc. Now, how do we model that in economics? Well, the basic neoclassical model reduces all of that to what they call factors of production. They reduce everything to labour and capital, which they treat largely as homogenous within themselves, and you've got labour and capital as inputs and goods as outputs. Now, there are numerous problems with this. It would take an entire lecture series to explain it all, and they were debated in what's known as the Cambridge controversies that occurred back in the 60s and early 70s between Cambridge in the UK and Cambridge in America. Now, most neoclassical think either they don't know the debate even happened, which is the common case, or they think they won it. And in both cases, of course, it did occur and they lost it. And in fact, the person who conceded defeat of all people was Paul Samuelson. You don't get a much higher ranking neoclassical conceding defeat than that. Robert Solow continues to whinge about it, but in reality they lost the debate. Yes, Ram?
Actually, Solow also, if you remember, President showed Solow also agreed later on, but he still continued on his aggregate position.
Oh, he won the debate and continued, he lost the debate and continued using the tools with which he lost the debate. It's disgusting. This is one of the things I'm so critical of neoclassical economics. Even when you convince them that they're wrong, they continue working in exactly the same way. It's outrageous, so I agree entirely. And Samuelson and I trash like crazy in the new edition of Debunking Economics. The delusions that man was willing to go to hang on to his neoclassical beliefs are simply breathtaking. Now, I cover this in a lot more detail in my History of Economic Thought lectures and also in Chapter 6 of the new edition of Debunking Economics. Now, an advanced neoclassical approach was what they call general equilibrium, and that did have multiple goods as inputs and multiple goods as outputs, so that's a better way of going than the factors of production nonsense they teach to you guys. But there are problems even there because they assume the economy is in continuous equilibrium. Or if you look at the mathematics behind the models themselves do not and cannot converge to equilibrium. Even an exchange economy with more than 3 goods, or more than 2 goods, can't converge. So they talk about equilibrium and the mathematics of the model itself says the equilibrium is unstable. Again, that's bizarre. They should have said, well, it's unstable, it's a disequilibrium, let's build a disequilibrium model, but they didn't do that. So I covered that particular failing in Chapter 8. Now, post-Keynesian theories, most are dynamic, which is a good thing, so they actually look at production changing through time, but they use the abstraction of a single commodity and a constant ratio between labour input and GDP output, which isn't so good. Certainly I think including time is by far the most important thing. So I'd come down and say better than the neoclassical approach on that front, but still with the weakness of not looking at the input-output nature of production. Now, there are some economists who do. Their general rubric is called Schraffian because they're based on the work of Piero Schraffer, who developed the critique of the neoclassical theory of production in the first place. And they model production as multiple goods in and multiple goods out, which is great, but they also stick with the abstraction of equilibrium. So I think that's a major failing, and they haven't done anything worthwhile, in my opinion, to bring it into dynamics. So what I'm going to use here as a model is dynamic, which is good. Unfortunately, it's going to be a single commodity, which isn't so crash hot, and I'm going to use labour in and GDP out. I'm basically ignoring at this stage the capital sector of the economy. Now, that's bad, but I bring it in later. So just as some case of saying I can bring this in at a later stage. A later model I'll show you probably next week will have capital being produced, and I'll also show you models. I can model a dynamic multi-sectoral monetary economy as well, with commodities being produced by fixed capital, circulating capital and so on. It's all possible to get to that stage. This is just, in this case, it's a heuristic. As to mentioned assumptions beforehand in the course, I'm making a heuristic assumption here that I can treat it this way. At a later stage, I can bring in the more elaborate treatment. So you start with a basic argument that there's a single output of a Q or GDP, and labour is the input that produces it. And I've got constant labour productivity. Again, I'm ignoring at this stage growth in labour productivity over time. So with this simple equation, the quantity produced is the productivity per worker times how many workers you've got hired. Quite simple. And I've got a constant money wage as well. Again, I'll change that in this lecture. Now, to link the physical system I'm building up here to the monetary one I've built so far, I need a price level. So I have to derive some sort of relationship for prices, and it's going to be dynamic. I'm not going to be using a static price equation here. And I'll start with the question of, well, where would you be if you're in equilibrium? And I'm not going to end there. Again, it's a heuristic to work on further. So in equilibrium, price would just enable the flow of demand, and I'm talking in flow terms here, demand per unit of time, to equal the flow of output at the same time. Therefore, there's no pressure to adjust that price level. Now, the flow of output is quantity. And we know that that involves labour. And the amount of labour you're going to have employed will equal them. And now I'm working entirely in a monetary model here. So you've got a monetary flow of wages coming out of the monetary system. Divide that by the wage rate, you're going to have how many workers you've hired. So the monetary flow, as I explained in last week's lecture, is this funny looking thing. 1 minus S over tau S multiplied by FD. Now, going through part by part, that 1 minus S is the share that workers get of overall output. So it's talking about distribution of income between workers and capitalists. That's the share of total income that workers get. Tau S is the time lag, or the time constant, between financing production and getting your money back. That's the time between M and M plus in Marx's lingo. And FD is the balance at any particular point in time in the firm's deposit account. So that's the monetary flow of wages. If I divide that by the actual wage level, that'll tell me how many workers are employed. So it's simply now I've got the beginning of the link between the monetary system and the physical system. So physical output is then that amount of labour multiplied by labour productivity. And of course, Q is the flow of goods per unit of time. It's output per annum, effectively. When you're in equilibrium, I can certainly use an annual basis there. So, this computer's about to log off. I hope it isn't going to affect my presentation. Pardon me, another computer. I'll ignore it and hope it doesn't turn the screen off. Okay, that's my expression for quantity now. So I've now got an expression for the physical flow of supply. What I need now is the physical flow of demand. Well, that's going to be the monetary flow divided by the price level. And as I explained in last week's lecture, that monetary flow is the balance that exists in the firm's deposit account divided by this turnover period. That's because that is the sum of wages plus profits. That's total monetary demand in the economy. The demand from the banking sector is simply a transfer from one group to another. It nets out. So that's overall monetary demand. So if I divide that by the price level, which I still don't know as yet, the price level in equilibrium, I'm going to have an expression for the physical number of units demanded per annum. Now, in equilibrium, those two flows are going to be equal. By the way, that ultimately doesn't apply at any stage in the model because I have growth going over time. But I then say there's equilibrium demand, equal to equilibrium supply. So I can now rearrange that and solve for the important little part we don't yet know, this equilibrium price. So doing some rearranging, what I get is this expression. Messy, but there's a whole lot of cancellations there. For example, the time lag, the time delay, they cancel out. The amount in the deposit account cancels out. So I'm left with a simple equation of saying price in equilibrium is going to be 1 over 1 minus S multiplied by W divided by A. What does that mean? What it's saying in equilibrium, price is a markup on the monetary cost of production. Because that first bit, 1 over 1 minus S, is greater than 1 because S is greater than 0. And that's the share going to capitalists. That's effectively profit share and national income. W is the wage rate. That's the money wage per worker. And when dividing it by A and dividing it by output per worker, that's telling you therefore the cost of the monetary cost of production per unit of production. Now that happens to be the same equation that's used by Koleski, which is common in post-Keynesian economics. So I'm deriving the same equation dynamically from a monetary model, which I'm very pleased with. So it's saying prices convert the physical surplus into a monetary one. That's really the mystery behind how you get a monetary profit. You've already got a physical surplus generated by a productive economy. This is now converted to a monetary one by the price level. So that's consistent with post-Keynesian views. And what I've now say, well, let's make this dynamic, because we're not going to be in equilibrium at any point in time in these models, except when I actually build in a totally static economy, a totally non-growing economy. That's a basic dynamic equation. We're saying the rate of change of prices, which is the first bit, is going to be a time-lagged response to the gap between the actual price at any particular point in time, which is P, and the equilibrium relationship. Yes, Saram?
1 by 1 minus S. So S stands for...
The share of surplus going to capitalists, which if you, it's a percentage, so if you have...
Yeah, so it's between 0 and 1.
Between 0 and 1, that's right.
So if it is, if the share which is going to the capitalist,
Yeah.
so that means if it is more than 0.5, so if it is, if workers get more than capitalists, then there will be inflation.
If they do get more than capitalists, no, normally is a value for S of about 0.25 or 0.3.
So this basically says that this is something much required like inflation. If workers get most of the share,
Yeah.
then you will have inflation.
No, you don't get inflation.
Because if you see 1 by 1 minus S, if you see,
Yeah.
if S is, if S is say 0.99999,
Yeah.
1 minus 0.999 is 0.000001.
Yeah.
So 1 by 0.001 is a block.
Huge. Yeah, it's a huge markup. You don't get you get a markup of about 40%. That tends to rule between monetary, and that's what I use in the modelling as well. So the minimal system I need for production is just those three equations. Quantity is productivity times labour. Labour is the money wage volume divided by the wage rate, and the monetary rate, that's the rate of change of prices. So the overall model is this physical system coupled with the monetary flows table I built up for you beforehand. Now this is putting it in slightly more detail, and I'm including deposit interest being paid here, all of which is quite simple extensions to the model I built live in QED last week. But you then get, and this is also including repayment, which I'm going to cover as well in the system. Now in equations, that's what it looks like. Okay, I can see plenty of squinting faces here. If I tried to explain that stuff to you straight from the equations, you wouldn't know what the hell I was talking about. You get the classic Migo effect, my eyes glaze over. But in fact, if you understood the table, which I read through to begin the lecture and could cover again later, the table's easier to follow. That's why I use this tabular approach to building the financial system. There's the price equation, as I explained it to you, there's the labour equation, and there's output. Now if you simulate it, you get a system where the price converges, where I have no growth going on, the price converges to 1.333, starting from 1, and that gives you the 40% markup. Output stabilises and labour stabilises. So it's actually a quite workable monetary model of production. And one thing which happens here, I started the model from the extreme position where there was only money in the vault and no money anywhere else, and therefore monetary demand effectively starts at zero but grows very rapidly. And the physical economy had no labour employed, therefore no output. Now, what happens over time is they converge to each other, even with that extreme starting position. So, with the original monetary flows only model, those were the values I got for the various bank accounts, which is all I had as systemic elements at the time. When I do the expanded model where I've got production as well and prices, then I get exactly the same values in equilibrium for the various accounts, but I also get equilibrium price level, level of output, and number of workers. I've got A being 2, so each worker produces 2 units of output, just so I get a different value for L and Q there. Now, when I do the monetary estimates of profits, as I showed you last week, that's the rate of surplus times the firm deposit accounts divided by the turnover rate, turnover period. And that converges over time to equal the physical estimate, which is prices times quantity minus costs. I've actually got wages and interest rates inside there, by the way. That's a mistake from an earlier set of slides. And it's also the monetary estimate of wages converges to the monetary value of wages. The wages in the monetary system is 1 minus S multiplied by FD divided by tau S, turnover rate. The physical value says it's wages, the money wage rate, multiplied by how many workers you employ. And that also converges over time. So all these things are consistent. The monetary model and the physical system are consistent. So what have we got? Well, we've combined the circuit insights about the nature of credit money with a very basic approach to dynamic modelling. And what we've got is a working model of capitalism as a circular flow. It isn't just a diagram. Most of the time when you see one of these circular flow diagrams, they're just drawings. Now the crazy thing is, it's been possible for the last 50 years to put that into actually operation and make it a dynamic real simulation of the system, because the software to do that and the knowledge of how to go about it has been something that's been in engineering for the last half a century. So you've got a working model of monetary flows and physical flows. You don't have to assume equilibrium to model. All these things are fallacies that economists have convinced themselves about, but they're fallacies. So I think it's actually a kind of economists' cowardice of stepping beyond the limits of what they thought was necessary in the 19th century. That means they're 50 or 60 years behind what the engineers have been doing in modelling dynamic systems properly. So what I want to do now is explain where some of those parameter values came from, and then allow for growth. And also begin being behavioural, because what I have so far is just fixed parameters, a fixed rate of turnover, a fixed rate of consumption and so on. All those can be changed to variables to reflect changing behaviour in response to changing levels of values in the economy. Now some of the values look a bit weird. For example, for the value I used to say workers' consumption rate was the value omega I set to equal to 26. And I used beta for bankers and made that a value of 1. And the full list of values is this lot. So I've got interest rate for deposits at 1%, interest rates for loan at 5%, capital share of output at 25%, the time lag in production being 3 months or 1/4 of a year. 26 for workers is a value of the consumption parameter, 1 for bankers. Loan repayment I've set as 1/7, and the recirculation of funds I set at 2. Now, interest rates are fairly obvious. They're based on long run averages, because if you look back through time, the real rate of interest is normally, or the gap between loan rate and deposit rates tend to be about 4%, so that's okay. The rate of surplus and turnover are arbitrary, but pretty close to what you find in actual distribution of income. So the other 4 are a bit strange. I've got to explain them for you. And I'll bring in loan repayments in a moment in the model with QED as well. And what they are inverse time constants. And a time constant is something that tells you how long a process would take to reach its equilibrium if it kept on going at a linear rate, which of course it doesn't, because the amount it's being, the tank the money's pouring out of falls in size as time goes on. So it's related to the slope of a function at its very initial point. I want to take you through the basics of this. So let's look at consumption, and imagine we've got a bank account with money in it. I'm just using M to label the money, where the money flows out constantly over time. So there's a constant rate of spending depending on what's currently in the account. I'm using omega here for let's say this is workers' spending. How fast does it go out? We can solve that using integration. So first of all, I do the shuffle and I convert 1/m dm dt into 1 dm over m being equal to omega times dt. Then I integrate both sides, one with respect to m, the other with respect to t. That gives me the log of m on one side and omega times t plus a constant on the other. Then take exponentials of that, so I get m at time t is going to be some constant, m0, the amount of money in the account to begin with, multiplied by e raised to the power of minus omega times t. Now, if I set m equal to 0 and omega equal to 26, this is what I get. And I've drawn, the red line is the actual amount of money in the account over time. The blue line is the tangent. And notice the tangent, you can just see if you've really got eyesight there, just crosses the axis at the value of 2 for 2 weeks, which is 1/26 of a year. Okay? That's the clue. So there's a link between the 26, which I've used for workers, and this time at which the derivative of how fast their money accounts start falling equals 1/26 of a year. That is no accident. So the slope of the tangent is the derivative of that function. If I take a look at and do the derivative of an exponential, then what I finally get, it's the exponential itself times whatever power it was raised to. So I get it's going to be equal to m0, which is 100, multiplied by minus omega times the original function. Now, that means the slope at that stage, the slope at t at 0, the slope of that is minus 2600. That's why it falls so rapidly. It goes from 100 to 0 in 1/26 of a year. Now, the tangent at the curve at that point, this is the equation of the tangent at time t equal to 0, and that's 100 at that point. It's sloping away at omega times t0, which is minus 2600. So what you get, So I've shown the tangent slightly more clearly here. You can probably see that one from the back of the lecture theatre. So the point where the tangent of the curve crosses 0 gives you that time constant, which is a convenient way to describe the curve, and the tangent hits 0 at 1/26th of a year. So rather than using the big number 26 to indicate how fast workers reduce their bank accounts and saying the rate of outflow is 26 times the current value of the account, I'm now saying it's equal to the account divided by 1/26, which is exactly the same thing, but I'm now explaining where the value of 26 comes from. So it's saying the time constant for workers' consumption is 1/26th of a year. Does that make sense? Just an easier way of saying it has exactly the same result, but it gives you a better way of working out what should I use as a value for that constant. And that's commonly used in engineering. Just to illustrate it again, this is looking at having a time lag of 1 year, which is what I use for the bankers, up to about 1/12th of a year, and you'll see that the point where the tangent crosses the axis here depends upon what my factor is here. Okay? Watch. Watch, he says, and it doesn't actually run. Come on. Great. Oh, here we go. Good. Okay, now you can see it. Okay, that's the basic idea behind it. Now, I'm going to use that as saying workers consume their wages 26 times a year, or spend their wages 26 times a year. Therefore, saying as a fraction of a year, that the time lag or the time constant for the consumption is 2 weeks and 1/26th of a year. So their consumption I'm now going to illustrate in this way, and that's the sort of expression I'll generally use, not that one, but this one. I'll generally use when I'm doing the modelling here. Okay, now let's go on to the next bit. So these strange parameters have got the following meanings. Tau S, which I've set at 1/4, says production takes a quarter of a year to go from paying for the initial inputs to selling the final outputs. Tau W at 1/26 says workers turn over their accounts every 2 weeks. Tau B of 1 sees bankers who are wealthier spend their accounts on an annual basis. Tau LR for loan repayment of 7 means loans take 7 years to be repaid. And Tau RR for relending reserves, or relending out of the vault, so they spend what's in the account or relend it every half a year. Okay, what about growth? Well, so far what I've shown is that Keynes was right. You can have sustained economic activity with a fixed stock of money. And that's, remember, I contrasted Keynes' view about a revolving fund of finance to Graziani's arguments about needing an ever-increasing amount of money. The mistake was a mistake in dimensionality. And capitalists can borrow money and make a profit, and debt, as I'll show, is easily repaid, though if you repay all the debt, eliminate it, there's no money in the economy, so nothing ever happens. So, in a way, it actually makes circuitous better than they thought they were, because they got this great starting point and then reached all these dilemmas about capitalism. It was just because they made that mistake of confusing stocks and flows. So what I've got to bring in now, though, is endogenous growth in the money supply. And here I'm going to bring in something from Basil Moore. Remember Basil's work on the empirical basis of endogenous money. And back when he wrote, the main way that firms would finance things like buying a new blast furnace or paying a wage rise was accessing their line of credit. And that was like your bank cards, your credit cards. If you have a $10,000 limit and you've only accessed $1,000 of it so far, then if you go shopping, you can swipe that card and buy something worth $9,000. And when you do, you increase your debt by $9,000 and you increase money in the economy by $9,000 as well. And there's no need for you to go in a bank and ask for it because you've been pre-approved. So you've got the capacity to create money by going shopping and create debt for yourself as well. So that's what Basil talked about, and I can now include that by having a new row in the table, and I'll show that now as we go across dynamically for a second. I'll put the table up first of all. So what I have initially is new money being created by an entry that occurs on both sides of the ledger. So let's look at that with a QED. Bring up the Godley table. I'm going to add a few elements. This will take a bit of time, but worth illustrating. Let's make the window a bit larger there. Okay, first thing, I'm going to add a new row for repay debt, and that's going to be a transfer of minus F from the Ferns account across to the vault. You're paying it back, you're returning it to the capital. And of course, you have to record that. So the bank has to record the debt's been paid. So that's going to be minus, that's going to be taken off the account there. So I've got F as an extra term to include. I'll just leave it at that because with having lending at the top, I'm going to get a system where there's both lending out of the accounts and payments back into them now. Let's get new money being created. Actually, I'll stop at that point. It's worth stopping here, and I'll save that as 06. And I'll just define what that is now and show you how it works. So let's go to the COD equations, enter a new row, and I'll make this, I'll say a time lag here. So I'll say it's they repay the amount in the loan. Oh, notice by the way, when I press the up arrow key, nice little trick that Siri's put into the system, it lets you type a fraction. So I press the up arrow key, I'm now typing a fraction. A couple of down arrows here, and I'm going to divide it by tau loan repay, LR. I'll save that. And then I've got to define what tau LR is. So I'll say here, loan repay is 7, saying it's taking 7 years, as I said, to pay the debt back to 0 if you kept on paying off at that linear rate. To save all that, just shut these windows down so we can see the Godley diagram. Don't erase the existing diagram, but generate the new one. And now I've got extra operations setting up over here, so I have to drag all these down around a bit. That seems to be it. Let's see. I'll put it like that, I think. Bit messy, but that'll do. Save that. Bring up a graph window. And play. So now what you'll see is the vault won't fall quite to 0. It'll head down, but because loan's being repaid, at some stage the rate of repayment will equal the rate of relending, and it'll stabilise. Then you've got less money in circulating in the economy, so there's less economic activity, of course, than in the previous model, but of course it's more realistic because you do repay the loans. So rather than the vault going to 0 now, it's going to stabilise. You can see already the sum of repayment and the sum of loans are starting to approach each other. If I actually change to show the flow rates, you'll see that the rate of repaying is converging on the rate of lending, and therefore the amount of money in the vault is stabilising. Okay? So let's just stop that. That'll do. Let's go back over here. Now what I'm going to add is new money creation. And notice what I've got going on there is I'm adding J to both the loan and the deposit account at the same time, which is just like the operation of going to swiping a credit card, and then the aggregate, of course, increasing your debt level and increasing the amount of money in the account of the retailer you're buying something off. So let's whack that in here. Again, shut these down to fit them on the screen. Back to the Godley table. And now let's add a new row for, I'll call this new money. And let's say that turns up as G. And I'll put it in a separate row to emphasise that it's an accounting operation. This is like the bank saying, here's a great idea, here's $1 million, by the way, you owe us $1 million. So a dual operation there. Let's say this is 07. Now I've got to define G. And I'll have G going at, because it's an exponential growth system, I'll say something like NM multiplied by the amount that's currently outstanding in loans. I could use deposits there as well for the firms, of course. Okay, now I've got to define what NM is. So back over here and say NM is equal to, let's say a zero, let's say we're talking a Chinese system growing at 9% per annum. Save that. Go back over to the Phillips diagram. Generate it again. Yet again, gets really messy each time this is done. This is new money going in over there and being recorded over here. And then let's get the operations for the accounting side as well. So that'll do. Bring up the graph window again. Rewind and play. And now what you'll see is that probably the green line is probably the best one to focus on. That's the amount of money in the vault. That's being paid down, as in the previous system. But you can see new money is being created now. A few flow of new money being pumped into the economy. And at some point, the amount of money in all those accounts, the vault's the first one it's really obvious in, will turn around and start growing. Let's increase the speed a bit. So now you can see the firm's deposit account, which was going down for a while, is starting to rise. It's fairly obvious over here. And then off go these two parallel to each other, up goes the vault. So you've got a growing system. So I can now, yes, Sonna.
Did you say that the new money was growing exponentially?
Is new money?
Is it growing exponentially?
Yeah. Oh, not semi-exponentially. Okay, it's an exponential expression, but it will grow semi-exponentially given the overall dynamics of the system. You can see that's ultimately starting to appear now. We're at the very early stages of that right now. Once it gets big enough, then yes, it will be exponential compared to everything else in the system. Okay, let's stop that. So I've got growth, and I've related that to the firm's loans in that particular case, but in the slides here I've used, in the previous year I used a time lag and also used deposits, saying money doubled every 20 years. You can use, as I've shown, a range of values there. What you get, of course, as I've shown you in that simulation, is self-sustaining growth. The money supply continues growing, wages, profits and interest levels all grow. And of course, the physical economy at the same time, which is being powered by this, is also growing. The number of workers hired is increasing, price level, as you notice, still stabilises. And you've still got all those convergence issues applying, but more over times than in a static non-growth system. So the circuit insight that you must include money in banking in capitalism is bloody right. It's madness that economics tries to model capitalism without money. And of course, the most recent sign of the madness is awarding the Nobel Prize to Thomas Sargent for his work, which is one of the main ways of keeping money out of economic thinking and keeping dynamics out at the same time. So I regard that as a classic travesty by the Nobel Prize Committee for Economics. So, and I think with this approach, which began with the circuit school, and in this sense I think Graziani should get a Nobel Prize, was the beginning of, I think, the real way that we should be modelling capitalism, not the nonsense that neoclassicals have done. So that's beginning of the whole thing. Let's keep on building on the realism here. And of course, if we're going to bring in variable wages, then I get stuck with a wonderful issue called the Phillips Curve. You guys would all have had at some point in your macro lectures in the past, and it's supposedly a relationship found statistically between the level of unemployment and the rate of change of money wages. It's not the price level, by the way, in the initial formulation. Now, like most things in economics, it's been completely misinterpreted by the literature and by the textbooks. Phillips, the guy who came up with the idea, was actually a systems engineer. In my opinion, one of the most remarkable people who ever lived. And what he did back in the 1950s was convert across to economics and tried to use the tools of systems engineering at the time to teach economists how to do dynamics. And a bunch of neoclassical and at the time so-called Keynesian economists didn't have a clue. They did the old Migo effect, my eyes glaze over when he tried to do all this stuff, and he got satirised as doing what they call hydraulic Keynesianism, when in fact what he'd done is build both a hydraulic and an analogue computer model of the economy, two independent models. Remarkable thing to do back in the 1950s. So his objective was to introduce to economists how one can do dynamics. And this is his argument about why one should do dynamics rather than statics. He's saying recommendations for stabilising the economy have mainly been derived from multiplier models using comparative statics, which are still being taught 40 years later. He said that type of analysis doesn't provide a very firm basis for policies for two main reasons. The first is the time path is not even discussed, and as he points out, the actual time path can be far different to the equilibrium the model might get, the simple static model you're using. And you might get fluctuations, you might turn a stable system into an unstable one. He said, secondly, you can't actually consider variations. You've got to use that stupid assumption of ceteris paribus. And what he says here, with a dynamic model, you can actually ultimately include everything you think should be a variable, you can make into a variable, rather than assuming things don't change, and nonsense like that. So he built a dynamic model using a flowchart, and that's the initial flowchart that he drew. This is in an economic journal article. Back when you could get non-neoclassical papers published in the economic journal, which you can no longer do. Notice there he's got a level of demand leading to a rate of change of prices, dp dt. So it's a dynamic model. Now, as part of putting this all together, he postulated that there was some sort of relationship which was non-linear between the level of output and the rate of change of wages and prices. And here's the statement he made in that paper. We may postulate some relationship between the level of production and the rate of change of factor prices, which is probably the form shown in this diagram. And he drew that. So the higher the level of production, the more the rate of change of prices rises, but it's non-linear. So with a very low level of production, you get a small rate of fall in prices. So to verify to see whether that existed or not, he spent a weekend going through numbers he collected using a manual, hand-cranked calculator. And that's where we got the Phillips curve argument from. And he said there was a clear tendency in the data that he saw between, I think, 1861 and 1913 for an inverse relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of change of money wages. But he also noticed, this is completely forgotten by most discussion of Phillips, that tended to be, the rate of change of money wages was higher when unemployment was falling and vice versa. And he then fitted an exponential curve to this data. He had to use logarithms because that's how you did number crunching before computers. There's the rate of change of money wages, that's the unemployment rate, and he finally derived this curve. Now the dots you can see there are actual reading annual data for the level of unemployment and rate of change of money wages between 1861 and 1913. And notice there are 7 crosses there. He just simply averaged the values across a series of ranges and then fitted the curve to that average, again because that was really hard work back without a computer back in the 1950s. And he then said there are deviations, and he explained them by saying, well, there were wage price spirals due to wars, Napoleonic conflicts and things like that, Crimean War, and rising unemployment would also lead to the curve being below, the data being below the curve. Now he then extrapolated the data to data we already had from 1913 to 1948. And with a couple of glaring exceptions, he found that it fitted the curve for that later period as well. Now that weird one down there, the English Trade Union Council, after the experience of inflation during the First World War, negotiated a cost of living adjustment arrangement with the employers, which shot them in the foot because the British government then reintroduced the pound, or the gold standard, and prices plunged and workers had to accept a huge cut in their wages. 1940 shouldn't need much explanation. Beginning of the Second World War, cut off from supplies from Europe, so price of agricultural commodities and stuff rise and therefore prices go up. Now, because they didn't comprehend his dynamics, they instead simply saw that curve as illustrating a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Choose whatever level of unemployment you want when that was the target, here's the rate of inflation you're going to have. Now, that doesn't work in a dynamic model. If you choose a particular point in the system, it's going to move away from it. Okay? It was a fallacy to interpret it that way. But the result of interpreting in that fashion means that Keynesian economics got tied up with the idea of there being a simple trade-off, and that was how Milton Friedman managed to demolish the Keynesian school at the time, or the so-called Keynesian school. Now, the funny thing is, even though that was used to demolish the Keynesians by monetarists, all schools of thought have got some idea of a relationship between unemployment and the rate of change of money wages, and it's still used by the neoclassicals as well. So I'm going to bring it in the way Phillips meant to bring it in, as part of a dynamic model in the second half of this lecture. Let's take a break. See you in about 10 to 15 minutes. Oh, by the way,